So moving on then from Derrida, I want to enter into a discussion of Deleuze's book, The Logic of Sense, which is the book that he wrote after Difference and Repetition, and some of the ideas which later turn up in Anti-Oedipus, such as the concept of the body without organs, appears here for the first time, but in a surprisingly different context and in a different way. And so this is before the D&G collaborations that come later. And what I want to do, the chapters in this book are very short, and so what I'm going to do is still stick with the video to chapter format, but since the chapters are so short, the videos will be correspondingly short as well, because I want to try to stick with the micro details of Deleuze's text as closely as I can. Everything is in the details with Deleuze. And so I want to move right into the book then, which is called The Logic of Sense, and the opening chapter is called The First Series of Paradoxes of Pure Becoming. So what he wants to do is to draw your attention to the problem of paradox, because the book is going to be an investigation into sense-making, into the structure and genesis of sense, how we make sense out of anything. And in a way, what Deleuze is doing is very much opposed to the sort of thing that Derrida was doing. Deleuze is, in many senses, despite being a French postmodern intellectual, from Derrida's point of view, he would be a kind of traditional metaphysician who builds systems, because what he ends up doing in this book is to construct a series of strata of sense that's similar to what he does with Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, when they construct the difference between the plane of immanence or composition and the plane of organization. And then on the plane of organization, there are all these different strata that correspond to the physical-chemical world. He's going to do something similar in The Logic of Sense by building a strata of sense-making that begins with the infant's experience with noise, and the body without organs is a realm of noise intensities that is a kind of chaos that moves eventually into the realm of the voice, where the infant begins to recognize the voice and begins to form a grammar, putting together graphemes and phonemes, and phonemes, not graphemes, putting together phonemes and beginning to make sentences, and then moving on there to the tertiary level. And in the third level of sense, Deleuze will distinguish between three different kinds of propositions with the three different classical syntheses, the conjunctive synthesis and the connective synthesis and the disjunctive synthesis and so forth. So we'll get into all that as we go along. But in this chapter, he just wants to draw your attention to the concept of pure becoming. Pure becoming, and in many respects, this text itself is an analysis of Lewis Carroll's two Alice books, Through the Looking Glass, which is the sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which Lewis Carroll, if you haven't read the book, I would strongly recommend reading it before reading Deleuze, this book, Logic of Sense, since you need to have the images in your mind that he has in mind. Like, for example, he opens up with the first paragraph with a classical image of Alice growing larger. If you recall in some of the film adaptations, if you haven't read the book, and today one can't assume that anyone's read anything, but one can assume probably that one has at least seen one of the film adaptations, either the Tim Burton, which is of course not faithful to the text at all, but actually the original Walt Disney film from the 1950s is probably the closest adaptation, and incidentally one of Disney's best films, I think, to the novel, in which after Alice takes the pill at the beginning of the novel, she begins to grow large, and she can't stop it, and she becomes too large to fit into the house, and then she takes another pill and it reverses her, and she grows too small to reach the table. She's down to the size of a little mouse, and she can't reach the table to get the key to open the door, so she's got these problems on her hands. And what Deleuze says, basically what this is, though, is a paradox in which Alice becomes, what is happening to her is a pure becoming, a pure event. And this type of pure becoming, this pure event, is a paradox in which it can be said of one that contradictory states can be applied. A subject can have predicates that are opposed to each other. In this case, Alice is both small and large at the same time. As she shuffles up and down, she more or less becomes small and large at the same time, and in doing so, effaces the distinctions between the present and the past and the future. The timeline gets scrambled in pure becoming because it's composed of both future and past states simultaneously, whereas the opposite logic, and then he moves on and he says, Plato points out, he makes a distinction between two different types of becoming. The becoming of the limited realm of measure in which you have substances with specific attributes that are based on the principle of contradiction. In Aristotelian logic, a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time. And so in traditional logic, the logic of traditional becoming, things have stable identities and they go in a linear progression through time, step by step, following a linear sequence of time. You move from old to middle age or from young to middle age to old age. In the movie Benjamin Button, of course, the sequence is reversed. That film begins with a pure becoming in which we have the event ontology scrambled, and it begins with the future in which the old man gradually gets younger, and so forth. So that's the logic of pure becoming, and Plato makes this distinction. He's aware of it, according to Deleuze, between this distinction between limited becoming and pure becoming, which Deleuze identifies with events. And then he moves on then to discuss how then what happens in the logic of pure becoming is that it's a different kind of logic. It's a different kind of sense-making, because in the limited logic, the limited type of logic in which you have a subject with attributes that do not conflict with each other, and this basically actually in the Hindu tradition would be regarded as the logic of pure waking consciousness, whereas the other logic, the logic of Lewis Carroll, is basically the logic of dream, myth, and art, in which things often are paradoxes and can often be both one thing and its opposite at the same time. Exactly what Aristotle said is in defiance of the laws of logic. It isn't in defiance of the laws of logic. It's a completely different set of logic. It's the logic of dream and myth. And I think that's the logic that Deleuze has in mind here at the beginning of this analysis. But he wants to draw your attention to the fact that this logic in scrambling the timelines, in scrambling the future and the past, and in making it possible to have contradictory predicates happen at the same time, it's a logic of events, of verbs, that tend to undermine the substantiality of the subject. So the subject's sense of self-identity is based on, of having a permanent sense of self-identity, is based on having things happen to one in a kind of a linear fashion. But when one is put through the grinder, as Alice is in this text, when one is put through the grinder of pure events that take place that are contradictory, and you get all these contradictory states happening all at the same time, it tends to destabilize, undermine, and scramble the sense of a stable self-identity. So this is one of the things that Deleuze is interested in, because he deconstructs the self, as does Derrida, as does Foucault. They all get rid of the self in different ways and to one degree or another, and show how the contemporary postmodern self is really not there anymore in any concrete sense, in the stable concrete sense of a Cartesian cogito, of which it can be said that you're a stable substance and you have properties as adjectives. That whole syntax, that whole grammar, that whole structure of having a subject with predicates is undermined by the logic of pure becoming, in which you have pure events, and the sense of self-identity slides down into the realm of verbs, where things are continually happening that destabilize and undermine your sense of self-identity. Now McLuhan this is one of Alice in Wonderland was one of his favorite texts, and he had talked about how the thing for him about Alice in Wonderland is that it represents a singularity in the West in the realm of literature that's somewhat similar to what happens with Manet and painting, which comes out at about the same time, his great painting Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, breakfast on the grass, or luncheon on the grass, in which you have the abolition of the laws of perspective in that painting, and the same thing with Lewis Carroll. All the traditional laws of the metaphysical age and the realm of three-dimensional perspectival space break down and dismantle and disintegrate in Lewis Carroll's narrative. And McLuhan saw this as a manifestation of the electrical acoustic world that began coming in and was being configured by the rise of electric technologies in the 19th century. Because when you have a speed up, an acceleration toward light speed, as we started to get first with the telegraph coming in the 19th century, and information comes beaming at us from all directions simultaneously, the newspaper becomes, with its multiple stories and multiple points of view on the same page, becomes the literary analog to what the novel had been. The novel puts events in perspective and subordinates them to a single point of view in the previous age, the perspectival, metaphysical, three-dimensional age. That, for McLuhan, all melts down, and the Alice narrative shows us a universe in which Alice exists in her own space, disconnected from the three-dimensional space. We no longer have in Alice in Wonderland a world of subjects or a world of figures that are put within three-dimensional phase space, which is a phase space that is subordinated to a single perspective, held together by the eye, and it's visually dominant. The sense of the acoustic sense, hearing from all directions in a three-dimensional simultaneous acoustic radius, and the sense of touch, the tactility. The sense of touch is discontinuous. And in the old magical the tribal world, the pre-literate oral tribal world, like with Eskimo carvings, you have the animal carved onto the walrus ivory is its own thing in its own space. It makes its own world. It's not in a world together with other things in a homogeneous space. And so for McLuhan, this text becomes the beginnings in literature of what we have with Manet and painting, the beginnings of the breakdown of the laws of perspectival space, of the metaphysical age. But it could also be said that that is precisely the age of the rise of waking consciousness and its laws, which cuts and severs the laws of the medieval Christian cosmos and all of its mythologies, which begin to disintegrate, and a waking consciousness constructed by a single subject that is out alone in space begins to configure, and we have a dominance of the laws of logic and the laws of waking consciousness, of causal, mechanistic thinking, Newtonian laws in which we have the billiard ball model of cause and effect. All of that's effaced and done away with in this age, which is also the age of Einsteinian electrodynamics, in which we have the breakdown of space and time. They fuse together harmoniously, paradoxically, but each object carves out its own space and its own time. Objects move so fast at the speed of light that each one creates its own space-time, its own frame of reference that's entirely separate from all of the other objects. So we have multiple spaces, multiple times. Same thing in Alice. We have the disjunction and the cohabitation. The effects can come before their causes, as when the Mad Hatter is tried before he's committed any crime. So effects precede their causes, and indeed causality in the Einsteinian cosmos becomes a questionable thing. Did that event which happened over there happen before this event which happened over there? It all depends on your frame of reference and how fast each one of these frames of reference is moving with respect to the other reference frames. So causality becomes a rubbery thing, like the wet watches in Dali's paintings. Dali's painting of the famous sort of wet watches, the fluidity, a new rubbery fluidity begins to come in now in the ontological world picture. And these two types of logic, I think, that Deleuze begins his text with, are very similar to these two types of laws, and it's almost as though there were a rediscovery of the laws of dreaming consciousness, in which you have a realm of pure becomings in which you don't have any longer stable subjects with exclusive predicates. A man cannot be both old and young at the same time, but in the realm of dream and myth, of course, a man can indeed be old and young at the same time. As in the case of Benjamin Button, where you have a full-grown man, an old man who is born, who is a child coming out of the birth canal, but yet is also an old man, but is a child in terms of his mental development and so forth. So you both have the predicates of old and young at the same time, inhering in the same subject, in the realm of art and dream and myth. So this is going to be the distinction between pure becoming. Now notice that, if anyone remembers or has read Difference in Repetition or remembers my discussion of it, this logic of pure becomings resembles the logic of the third synthesis of time he had talked about in that book, in which he had talked about the synthesis of habit and the synthesis of memory, which are both based on forms of repetition of the past and the present. And then by the time you get to the third synthesis, you have the pure synthesis of the event that is based on difference, and the emergence and rupture of novelty and singularity that comes in and destroys the subject's sense of identity. You get the man without qualities, for example, in opposition to the Proustian subject in the previous synthesis of memory and time. It's very similar to that. What he's talking about here is as these pure events and pure becomings. There's a certain, it's as though he's retrieving his event ontology of the third synthesis of time and carrying it over to become one of the major forms of sense-making. So this is the distinction that he begins his book with. So it'll be interesting to see what he does.